Hello. Today I'm going to interview Tahrir al-Santouri, a Sudanese filmmaker and scholar who has been in the Sudan for many years, making films, recovering the history of her country, and producing work of very fine quality. The Sudan is a country which only comes to life for most people in the West when there's a crisis or a civil war or a tragedy or a disaster. It's a country which is never discussed dispassionately, and conflicting narratives about this country dominate Western thinking when indeed they think about it. How should this country be seen? Whose country is it? And what is going on there now? Tahrir, thank you very much for joining us today. Just give me a brief account of the Sudan today, and then we'll delve back into history.
Today, well, Sudan is a recently partitioned country. In July 2011, South Sudan Republic was officially formed. And so now we have two Sudans. We have North Sudan, or just Sudan, and we have the South Sudan Republic. Of course, the partition came at the end of a very long civil war. Sudan has been at war ever since its independence in 1956. But this second phase of the civil war between North and South Sudan lasted for 20 years.
Let's go back now to the colonial legacy, because Sudan was, of course, occupied by the British. It was a British colony during the days of the British Empire. What was the legacy?
Well, Sudan was called the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, and it was a joint colonization because it was the Egyptians and the British, although of course in effect it was the British who were administrating Sudan, and so it was administrated as the entity we had before partition, and there was an uprising. When the Sudanese, there was a popular uprising by the Mahdi, and the Sudanese, it was remarkable because Sudanese from all different parts of Sudan, all the different tribal groupings from the east, the Bija, from Darfur, the west of Sudan, the Four and the other Darfuri tribes, and then from the north, they all came together under the leadership of the Mahdi and wanted to expel colonial rule.
The Mahdi, of course, was a figure of dread in London in places, not because he was a Muslim leader, but because he was the first leader, really, not just in that region, to inflict a military defeat on the occupying British forces. I mean, General Gordon, one of the top British generals, was martyred in that city, and then another army had to be sent. So the Mahdi was successful, partially, and it's the success that created his image of being a sort of wild man of Sudan, depicted always in drawings as a character like that, whereas in effect, in a period before the progressive movements and parties and nationalism proper was born, the Mahdi effectively was fighting for the national liberation of his country.
Yes, I mean, I think the Mahdi's project was rather complex, but it was an idealistic project. I think he didn't see his project just in terms of Sudan. What he saw it in terms of was an ummah, And so he was a very ambitious man and saw his project as unifying
the Muslim community.
The known Muslim community at that time. But for that project, his first step was to unify different and conflicting Sudanese forces and to inspire him to join his project. So that was interesting. But I think representations of Sudan and who the Sudanese are can go back to that time, to the Mahdi. Kipling wrote a famous poem called Fuzzy Wuzzy, which was about how the Sudanese, broke the British square in the battle in which Gordon's forces were defeated, and so it was a problematic representation from the point of view of the Sudanese, because although this Sudanese warrior is acknowledged for his courage, he is also talked of as a beggar, as a big black bounding beggar, and so I think. These conflicting representations of Sudan and what those representations are for can go back to that time.
You don't remember the Kipling poem, do you?
Well, I encountered the Kipling poem oddly, personally, at a very personal level, on my first day at an English boarding school, when we were shown around and it was explained that these what they call young ladies at that time are from Sudan. One of the girls said, "Oh, of course, the Fuzzy Wuzzis are also Sudanese," and I remember feeling terrible. Immediately I felt terrified by this idea of being known as a Fuzzy Wuzzy. And then it's only subsequently that I went and learned that this Fuzzy Wuzzy has been, of course, immortalized in this poem, and that he now describes who I am.
So let's move to the post-independence period. The British have departed. Sudan is now an independent state. What happens?
Well, it was a troubled state, because what happened is that it was the British left, but there were many contradictions in the Sudan we inherited. The south of Sudan at the time was felt that they had almost been cheated by the British, because the north had been developed. That is where the colonial administration was, and so the civil servant jobs that were available post independence all went to northern civil servants, and the south was very poorly represented in government, and so immediately after independence there was a rebellion in Torit, and that really was the beginning of the first Sudanese civil war, which lasted until 1972.
But this civil war was a North versus South civil war?
Yes.
And that had religious connotations?
I mean, I think this is how it was represented, and again, how things. We go back again to how things are represented. What are the media narratives about Sudan, and what the complexities are, and how they are understood by the Sudanese. And often the two are not the same. And so, of course, the war in the West was represented as a war that is to do with religion. But I think it was also a political
It's always the same, wherever the British Empire was, this division was created. A particular section of society, certain social layers, regionally, were privileged, and once the British left, that created mayhem. You can see it in Cyprus, You can see it in Ireland, you can see it in India, Pakistan, you can see it in Sri Lanka with the Tamils and the Sinhala people. The pattern, the colonial pattern, is virtually the same. It takes different forms, but it is basically dividing the original population and having a privileged layer within it, which leaves, problems which can't be solved for decades, if at all. Many of these old colonies are still facing problems. When you say that a civil war started immediately after independence in 1956, what form did it take? Was it an armed conflict?
It was an armed rebellion. What happened was there was a mutiny in a garrison town in the south called Toureet. The government moved in to quell the rebellion, and there was a kind of an agreement of sorts, according to historical commentators. In my film, Our Beloved Sudan, Rebecca Garang says that that the reason that the rebellion then progressed to become a protracted civil war was because of the harshness with which the ringleaders were dealt with which the dissidents were dealt with. And I think, there is never one reason, but there was a legacy of mistrust, a legacy of domination, and there wasn't, I think, a kind of political wisdom in dealing with these contradictions by the Sudanese post-independence.
So there was a settlement in 72?
In 72, the first civil war came to an end. It was at the time when General Muhammad Jafar Nimeri was in power.
When he had taken power via a coup d'etat,
yes,
abolishing all the trappings of democracy.
Yes, this was in 1969 that his coup took place, and in 1972 he came to agree a peace with what was then called Anania, which was the rebel movement in the south, or what they would say the liberation movement in the south.
And how long did this peace last?
It lasted, 1972. I think war broke again in around 1985, 84, around that time. Again, war broke out because within the Anania movement emerged as a leader John Garang, and he was not satisfied, or he and his followers were not satisfied with how the agreement, the Addis Ababa Agreement, the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement, was being implemented.
So that rebellion never ended, the one which began in 1985?
Well, it ended technically in 2005 with the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement,
yes,
which laid the groundwork for the separation.
But tell me something, where does Darfur fit in all this? You have, I'm trying to visualize it for our viewers. We have a civil war between North and South, constant conflict, agreement that there should be a federal solution. The South feels that the North is not honoring that agreement as it had promised to do. Conflict resumes again, and even on a low intensity level carries on. And then in the early years of this century, you have a movement, if you like, within this struggle in Darfur, which attracts a great deal of attention in the West. What are the origins of the Darfur conflict?
Well, I think Darfur came to the public consciousness, or to the Western public consciousness, in 2003, when there was an armed resistance that emerged in Darfur. But I think its roots go much further. I mean, again, Professor Mamdani talks about Darfur at great length, and he locates the genesis of the troubles in the colonial policies of indirect rule. But as I said, it came to the public consciousness in 2003. There was a drought which upset the balance of the way the population in Darfur was living. Armed militias where the government recruited armed militias, what we now know as the Janjaweed, to quell the resistance. I think the Janjaweed were recruited even before this current government, this current Islamist government came to power in 1989. So that project had begun, and of course, I think one of the unintended consequences of it was an escalation and a militarization of the struggle in Darfur. So again, I think this terrible lack of wisdom and lack of far-sighted analysis of the consequences from our political leadership in Sudan that results in situations of conflict becoming chronic rather than being resolved.
But explain to me a bit about what you think were the real origins of that conflict. There was a drought, there were refugees fleeing drought-ridden areas to other parts of the region. But what were the mechanics of it? I mean,
I think it's power is at the heart of these things, because a lot of the significant members of the Darfuri resistance leadership were already members of the Islamist political grouping, which is called the Inghaz. And they broke away, and I think it was to do with reaching the seat of power and really comprehending fully that there is a glass ceiling if you are not a Sudanese who is of the northern Arab Riverian tribes. You reach a kind of glass ceiling, and I think it was perhaps that realization that it's almost like Sudan has to be reimagined and reconfigured to reflect its demography.
And did the Darfur conflict, therefore, play a big part in what was to happen not so long after, i.e. the split in Sudan?
Well, I think the Darfur was taking place in tandem, because I think they are two separate issues. The South Sudanese have always, since the colonial period, there was an ambivalence about what this entity, geographical entity that is now what we know as South Sudan Republic, whether it should belong in this entity called Sudan, or whether it should be an independent state, or whether it should be part of Uganda. These were discussions that were taking place before the independence of Sudan. The British actually were not sure what to do with South Sudan, where it should fit in, where it should belong, and it was a last-minute decision to include it in Sudan. And so, it was a troubled region, and it was a region that had always had elements of it that understood their nationhood as separate. Whereas the Darfuris, I think, it's a different issue. The Darfuri resistance is not a separatist movement.
And in terms of the final breakup of the country, which, as you've explained, was always a fragile state, What role did the West play? Did they encourage the breakup finally or not?
I mean, of course, there is a school of thought that sees all of our troubles as linked to that legacy of colonialism. And of course, the colonial legacy had a part to play. Of course, especially in the engineering and of the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, this was an agreement that was, conceived by IGAD, but in partnership with the Americans, the Norwegians, and the British. So of course, there are regional factors, there are geopolitical interests in the fate of Sudan. But as a filmmaker, when I went to tell the story of the partition, I really was interested in the internal dynamics that led to our fragmentation in a way. I was interested in those because I feel whatever we've inherited as a legacy, what have we done with it? How can we be responsible? And that was a central question in all of my work, actually, not just our beloved Sudan.
And how has South Sudan been since it separated and became an independent state? Some of the reports that we have had are that conditions are in some areas much worse than they were before.
Definitely. I mean, I think definitely, the euphoria and the high hopes of independence have not been realized. And I think, now it is up to the friends of South Sudan that have, to stand by that troubled country until it can stand on its own 2 feet. And of course, in Sudan, there were people who, in the Sudan, the North was very sentimentally attached to the South not leaving, and there was this very sentimental, we are brothers, it's impossible. For many people, the idea that the South will go its own way was difficult to conceive. But for South Sudanese, that was not the case because, they voted overwhelmingly for separation. Now, I don't know, so really it's a very complex issue.
And what are the scholars and professors and academics and others who were totally for the breakup in the Western Academy, not least at the School of Oriental and African Studies and other places, who were for all this? Do they write about this subject now? Do they follow the situation going on in southern Sudan?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I think, again, we go back to representation and how how media narratives really influence the way we think about the world around us. And with South Sudan, the media narrative was seeing a homogeneous people with this noble dream to create their new Jerusalem, and it failed to acknowledge the enormity of the task before before South Sudan, and that task is really about how to create a narrative that all of the South Sudanese can feel part of, and one of the protagonists in my film says that without a unified army, you cannot have a state, and again there were these very practical, hard-nosed issues that were not addressed.
The other problem, of course, is that creating new states in this epoch in which we live it's not simply the creation of the state. It's what do you put in this new space? How is it going to function? Who is it going to benefit? And if all you create is a tiny new elite which reproduces all the mistakes, all the faults, all the greed, all the corruption of the elite that they have replaced from the north, then many people say, well, what's different? You know, we've got a government which is a state, a population which is largely homogeneous, but apart from that, what has changed?
Well, the population isn't homogeneous because there are many different tribes in South Sudan, as there are in North Sudan, but these tribes are at odds with each other. It started off as a political
North versus South conflict.
Well, no. Now I'm talking just about the South. You know, what happened in December 2013, when the violent tensions came to the surface within South Sudan Republic, when Riek Machar, the vice president of South Sudan, and Salva Kiir, the president, the president claimed that there was a coup attempt, and then violence broke out, and so
it goes on.
It goes on.
Tell me, Tahrir, what is the condition of women in the Sudan? I mean, is it any different in the Muslim north from the Christian south?
I mean, when I was making my film, it was I was living in Khartoum, but I would go to Juba. And it was really nice to be able to travel to Juba, you know, it was a freer environment, you know, simply not having to have, you know, as somebody who is a practicing Muslim but doesn't wear the headscarf, it was nice for me to not have to have it always in Juba. And I enjoyed just that sense of, you know, you would call it freedom, that sense of freedom. And it was nice to be able to sit in a cafe and not worry. But post, I mean, I think the situation of women in war is always bad. And what's happened in South Sudan with the recent outbreaks of violence to women is, of course, terrible. And it's a reminder how, even in a place where women are relatively secure and free in peacetime, the situation can turn around very fast when law and order breaks down. In the north, the situation for women is contradictory again. There are many women who are doctors, who are professionals, even engineers. And so women have degrees of independence.
In both parts.
Well, now I'm talking about the north. Right. But all of their lives are very carefully regulated. And in order to be able to function, you must conform to ideas about what is proper female conduct. You know, and so you feel very watched and very regulated, but within that framework, you are also quite independent and free.
The regime in the north currently is an Islamist regime. Any chance that it might change soon?
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question because it depends on so much. I think, I mean, we've seen the popular uprisings in the Arab world, and they haven't brought about clean regime changes.
But did that happen in the Sudan as well?
No, I mean the Sudan.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes, the Sudan did not. I mean, of course, there were moments of resistance, but they did not become
a big movement.
A big movement like they did in the other parts of the Arab world. But regarding what will happen to this regime, it's difficult. It's difficult to say. It's difficult.
Well, thank you for enlightening us, and we will return to this subject again.
Thank you.